I gave birth to a child for Aurelius. However, he didn't give me a proper status. He did this to take revenge on me for deliberately approaching him. When the child was 3 years old, I took the initiative to propose leaving. Are you going to abandon the child? I shook my head. I'll come back to see him. After a long while, the originally indifferent and cold man suddenly said softly, "What about me? Have you read the news? The president of the Aurelius family group was reported to have a child. When did he get married? Who's the mother of the child? I heard that she got pregnant before marriage. He's still single and hasn't gotten married yet." Really? Why? Why else? If he doesn't want to marry her, it means he doesn't love her. Right, Selna? Several gossipy colleagues all looked over at me. I was stunned for a moment and then forced a smile with difficulty. Yeah. The discussion continued. No one knew that I was the one Aurelius didn't want to marry. Late at night, the child had already fallen asleep. The edge of the bed sank as Aurelius came back. Instinctively, I wrapped my arms around his waist. "Why are you so late?" The man paused slightly and gently held my hand. It was a gentle movement, but he seemed to be avoiding any intimacy. "I've been busy lately." I took the initiative to lean on him and said pitifully, and didn't want me to comfort him when going to sleep. It took me a long time to get him to fall asleep. "Are you tired?" "It's okay. I'm not tired." Aurelius looked at me, and his voice was a bit deeper than before. "Get off." In the moonlight, his eyes were long and narrow, cold yet giving the illusion of being gentle. The strap on my shoulder slipped down my arm due to my movement. Seeing that I still shook my head, he didn't say anything more. His chest heaved for a moment, then he grasped my arm and directly turned over and pressed me down. All of Aurelius's restlessness in bed was caused by me. Come to think of it, perhaps it could be considered a kind of devotion in a way. This night, as usual, was filled with an unbearable tenderness. For years ago tonight, when we had our first physical intimacy, we were also so affectionate like this. It's just that there was no light on at that time. The smell of alcohol filled the air. He held me very tightly and murmured vaguely, "Don't go." At that moment, I realized who he had mistaken me for. It was Li Shiming, who had broken up with him and gone abroad long ago. The strength around my waist increased, and I suddenly came to my senses. Aurelius's kiss landed on my collarbone. "What are you thinking about?" He seldom took the initiative to kiss me. When he was emotional, he would at most kiss my collarbone or by my ear. I gently closed my eyes. There were many things I wanted to say, and I wanted to ask him what our relationship was now. In the end, I could only call his name unsteadily, Aurelius. "Yeah. Who am I?" After a long while, Aurelius chuckled softly, his voice hoarse. "Celine, it seems you're really not tired." The moonlight was dim, and I let myself be carried away by the moment. I first met Aurelius during the summer vacation of my freshman year. My father was a middle or senior level employee in the Aurelius family group. That day, he took me to visit the Aurelius family as a guest. The adults were in the study, and I was bored, sitting in the living room in a daze. In the midst of the awkwardness, Aurelius came back from outside. The young man was wearing a black t-shirt, with a bit of his collarbone showing. His skin was fair and cold-toned, and the veins on his arms were slightly protruding. He was full of high spirits. The moonlight I saw when I was young was the brightest. To this day, I still don't understand why I fell in love with him. Perhaps the weather was just too nice that day. It was so nice that because of our father's relationship, I started having interactions with Aurelius. I watched Li Shiming bravely pursue him like this. I watched them be together, quarrel, break up, and then one day he got drunk. After a night of indulgence, he was silent for a long time, then lowered his head and apologized to me and asked me what I wanted. I was wrapped in the quilt, my mind blank. It was a consensual thing, and it could even be regarded as a one-night stand. Aurelius still gave me enough compensation later to ensure that I would have no worries about food and clothing for several lifetimes. But I lied to him. I couldn't tell whether I was too stupid, too paranoid, or just sick in the mind. I lied to him that we had taken precautions, but I kept it a secret until the 4th month of pregnancy when the fetus had already taken shape, and then I went to him. Couldn't Aurelius tell what I was thinking? He knew everything. I was a woman who didn't love him but wanted to climb up the social ladder for benefits. My deliberate deception became a complete irony in his heart. Now I was reaping what I had sown. I woke up late the next day and the side of the bed was cold. He was always like this. No matter how intimate we were at night, he would still leave silently at dawn. In the living room, Anand was building blocks alone. The little one was growing up day by day. He was almost 3 years old, and his eyebrows, eyes, and face shape were all like Aurelius's. They say love me, love my dog. I couldn't help but touch his head. The little one said in a childish voice, "Mommy, don't be naughty." This tone was probably learned from Aurelius. In the past, when he worked at home, I would always hook my arm around his neck, and Aurelius would also say helplessly, "Don't be naughty." After having something to eat casually, not long after I arrived at the company, there was a commotion in the corridor. Unexpectedly, I ran into Aurelius here. The man was dressed in a suit, tall with long legs, and had a tough brow bone. He was walking towards the conference room surrounded by his assistant and manager. Outside the long corridor, his gaze passed over me without stopping for a second, as if looking at a stranger. I lowered my eyes sadly and wondered if last night's intimacy was just a dream. The noise in the corridor disappeared. My colleague Shawam beside me sighed and said, "He's so handsome. I don't know which lucky girl got to be with him." The rumor about getting pregnant before marriage was still spreading widely, and she must be talking about the person on the hot search. However, it's quite pitiful for a woman to have no marriage. Pitiful? I had never felt pitiful for myself, and I had never regretted it either. It's just that people always want to achieve perfection in life. So I let myself fall into the abyss again and again, wondering how long I could endure this kind of life. I mocked myself and said softly, maybe it's a case of one willing to fight and the other willing to endure. Towards evening, a message popped up on my phone, downstairs. Tomorrow was New Year's Day, and people on the street were in a hurry. Over the years, I had already learned to avoid the important and focus on the trivial, ignoring his indifference. In the car, I smiled and asked, "What's for dinner? Are you going to cook?" In the past, I often tried to learn cooking, but every attempt ended in failure. "Do you look down on it?" Aurelius' lips curved for a moment. He was about to say something when his phone rang. The voice from the receiver was faint. He frowned and said he got it. While hanging up, he turned his head. "I'll be a bit busy later." In other words, he wouldn't be able to make it back for dinner. I was stunned for a moment. "But it's New Year's Eve. I want to spend it with you." There was the sound of a car horn honking, and Aurelius didn't hear me. "What?" The car stopped in front of our house. Knowing that he was busy, I wouldn't make a fuss. I swallowed the words that were on the tip of my tongue. "Be careful on the road and come back early." The phone rang again, and Aurelius didn't rush to answer it. His dark eyes, whose emotions were hard to read, fell on me. "Ask Auntie to put Anand to bed. Don't let him stay up late." Actually, I still wanted to ask him if he would be back very late. The car had already turned around in the yard and disappeared from sight. At 10 o'clock in the evening, Anand and Aunt Wang had already gone upstairs to rest. There were people setting off fireworks outside the house. I watched silently. To be honest, it would be a lie to say that I wasn't disappointed. I didn't rush to go to bed. An indescribable sense of uneasiness welled up. It wasn't until my phone lit up. It was a photo sent by my best friend. The sound of firecrackers in my ears was distant yet clear. All my senses were focused on the cold screen. The background of the photo was in a hospital. Aurelius had his suit jacket hanging on his arm, and the girl beside him had her arm in a bandage. One was tall and the other was short, like a romantic scene in a movie, which made the corners of my eyes uncontrollably moist. So what he said about being busy was that he went to accompany Li Shiming. The door opened just as the clock struck 12. When Aurelius saw me, a trace of tiredness was obviously visible in his eyes for a moment. "Why aren't you asleep yet?" I didn't know when my knees had gone numb from sitting. I slowly stood up. I thought you weren't coming back. Aurelius pulled at his tie and said casually, where else would I go if I didn't come back? The atmosphere was too normal, and there was no chance for me to question him about what was on my mind. In fact, I didn't even have the right to question him. The dinner in front of me had already gone cold. Aurelius glanced at it. Did you make it? I shook my head. Maybe I should have pretended not to care as I used to, but that person happened to be Li Shiming. It just so happened that I knew Aurelius had loved her before. The feeling of loss gnawed at my nerves densely. After holding back for a while, I still couldn't help asking, what were you busy with? Li Shiming had a car accident. I went to see her. He had always been frank and didn't even want to lie to me. I hadn't heard the name Li Shiming from his mouth for a long time. It was like a hook, pulling open the hidden feelings that I had been carefully hiding, cruelly reminding me that it was through her that I got involved in all this entanglement. Did it have to be you? Aurelius paused slightly when pouring water. She doesn't have many friends in China. I had heard that Li Shiming grew up in an orphanage and had a strong personality. When she graduated, she had the opportunity to study abroad, so she directly broke up with Aurelius. After coming back after a few years, her friends would indeed become estranged. At this moment, listening to the man's fairly patient explanation, I didn't feel any better. My fingertips were clenched until they turned slightly white. I was still so vulnerable that I lost my composure just because of a name. Aurelius. I looked up at him and said in a low voice, if I hadn't lied to you back then, would you have loved? Aurelius put down the cup neither too gently nor too heavily and interrupted me. Don't you remember? You chose this path. There was a cold silence in his eyes. I had seen this look before. On the day when I took the pregnancy test report to him. In the top floor office, it was so quiet that you could hear a pin drop. All you could hear was the sound of breathing. Aurelius looked down for a moment and then said with a teasing smile, Celine, was it really necessary? He said, was it worth all this trouble? Yeah, was it really necessary? At the crossroads of life, I chose the most extreme path and even disrupted Aurelius's life. Now I had the nerve to ask him if he would love me. No one said anything in front of me. There was crying from the children's room upstairs. It disappeared after a while. Presumably, Auntie had gone to take care of it. I wiped the corners of my eyes in a flustered manner. I'll sleep with Anand tonight. As I turned around, Aurelius suddenly grasped my wrist and pinned me against the table. He hadn't eaten dinner, and he seemed inexplicably irritable. Why are you making a fuss? Just because of this? After he said that, I was speechless for a moment. Why did I suppress my feelings for several hours, guessing what he had done with Li Shiming, worrying about whether he would come back tonight? Even if he didn't come home, I had no reason to question him. It was like a knife cutting into my bones, but now it seemed that I was just making a fuss. At that moment, I suddenly thought of a possibility. Aurelius had never believed that I had feelings for him. Oh well. I slumped my shoulders. I'm not making a fuss. Anand was crying. I wanted to go and comfort him. Aurelius looked at me, and the hostility in his eyes became more and more obvious. His lips moved, and he just said, no need. I'll go. The warmth on my wrist disappeared. Watching his back as he turned and left, a sense of powerlessness swept over me. From the time I got pregnant until now, Aurelius hadn't let me worry about taking care of the child. He could do it all by himself, and it seemed that even if I left, he could still live a good life. In the past 6 months, have you ever had the slightest bit of affection for me? I turned around and looked into his eyes, shaking my head without hesitation. No, Xavier. The boy's eyes dimmed again. Suppressing my chaotic thoughts, I didn't fall asleep until almost dawn. As usual, every time I woke up, Aurelius had already gone to the company. But as soon as I went downstairs that day, I saw him feeding Anand breakfast. The morning sunlight shone in. Anand puffed up his cheeks and narrowed his eyes with a smile when he saw me, saying, Mom, you're awake. Anand's full name is Asher, which I named, meaning a bright future and peace all year round. thinking of the thought of leaving last night. Perhaps the only one who would be hurt was the child. I still feel sorry for him to this day. I gave birth to him out of my own selfish desires, but I haven't given him a happy and complete family. Aurelius gave me a faint glance and said to the side, "Sit properly." Anand was very obedient. However, just a few minutes later, he started clamoring to go to the amusement park to play. "Dad, is it okay?" His tone was coquettish and childish. Aurelius didn't rush to answer, "Do you want to go?" The white porridge was warm. I paused slightly while scooping it with a spoon. It took me a few seconds to react before I realized that this question was actually for me. In the past, Aurelius and I had quarreled before. Every time, I was the one who swallowed my pride to break the Cold War. Sometimes I would sleep in the guest room out of anger, but in the middle of the night, I still couldn't help running to the master bedroom and shamelessly snuggling into his arms. Aurelius was a light sleeper. He would wake up at the slightest noise. At that time, he would also habitually reach out his hand to embrace my waist. It was rather spineless. It was these cruel yet gentle details that made me reluctant to part with them until now. At this moment, hearing him take the initiative to start a conversation, it would be impolite of me not to take this opportunity. He wouldn't coax me again. I smiled and said, "Okay." Breakfast ended amid the child's cheers. Aurelius also planned to get up and go to the company. Only then did I notice that he was wearing a smoky gray suit today. "Why didn't you wear a tie?" Aurelius paused for a moment and said, "I forgot." Due to work requirements, I was a bit more meticulous than him in some aspects. In the past, if I woke up before he left, I would, like a wife, disregard his refusal and learn to tie his tie for him, even though it always looked ugly. I sighed inwardly and said, "Wait a moment." I hurried to the cloakroom. A few minutes passed when I went there and came back. When I went downstairs again, Aurelius was leaning against the entrance hall like that, not knowing what he was thinking. He had a good appearance, but there was no worldly hustle and bustle about him at all. I was only as tall as his chin. Perhaps seeing that it was too tiring for me to look up, Aurelius hesitated for a few seconds and then slowly bent down a little. Even though we had countless times of being close with sweat on our bodies, I was still a bit nervous. My fingertips brushed across the skin on his neck, and his Adam's apple sank slightly. He gently looked away. The tie was still not tied very neatly. I pretended to untie it and said, "Maybe it's better not to tie it." Aurelius didn't care and didn't even look at it. He glanced at the time and said it was okay. The sound of the door closing rang out. I listened to the sound of the engine outside gradually fading away. It seemed that something was not right, but I couldn't figure out the reason. The plan to go to the amusement park on the dining table was set for next week. Anand was obviously in a very good mood and was humming a children's song cheerfully while playing with puzzles. I accompanied him to play for a while, gave the nanny a few instructions, and then got dressed up to go to the company. I work in a media group. After working steadily for several years, I have also managed to become the editor-in-chief of Social News. But it's inevitable that I often have to work overtime. Anand took an enlightenment course on thinking before the Spring Festival. If I got off work early, I would go to pick him up. More often, it was Aurelius who went. That day, I worked overtime for an hour. I sent a message to Aurelius asking if he had picked up Anand. The phone was quiet for a quarter of an hour and finally lit up. Aurelius replied with just an mm. I scrolled up the chat history with my fingertip. Most of the messages were sent by me and replied by him. It was dull and uninteresting. I stared at the chat record for a while in a daze when my best friend's call came in. Ophelia is quite famous in the entertainment industry. When Aurelius and Li Shiming were photographed together, she happened to be filming in the hospital. The first thing she did when she came back today was to ask me to come out. I had already guessed what she was going to say. Drinking coffee at this time. You won't be able to sleep at night, I said with a smile. Ophelia threw her bag aside and said, "That's just right. I can take the time to figure out how your mind has gone wrong all these years. Li Shiming returned to China last month. Don't tell me you just found out recently." I didn't say anything. Ophelia looked at me and sighed for no reason. Celine, loving someone isn't like this. Have you ever thought about what you would do if they got back together? Giving birth to a child for him and finally having no proper status. Is it worth it? She asked if it was worth it. Aurelius asked if it was necessary. At this moment, I suddenly felt that I didn't even know myself. There's no curse more twisted than love. If I use being young and ignorant as an excuse for all this, wouldn't it be too superficial? Ophelia, we've already come this far. If that day really comes, I can only accept it. Yes, we've already come this far. But is this the result you want with your desperate persistence? As soon as she finished speaking, my mobile phone rang. I thought it was Aurelius, but it turned out to be my immediate superior. There was a meeting today. The director mentioned that an employee would be selected and transferred to the headquarters. I didn't express my opinion at that time. The woman's voice on the phone was persuasive. There's a lot of room for promotion at the headquarters. After thinking about it, I think you're very suitable for this opportunity. Would you like to consider it? The sky was getting dark. The moonlight was hidden behind the clouds. Through the glass window, under the street lamp in the distance, a familiar figure was standing there. Li Shiming was smiling and teasing the child in Aurelius's arms. I don't know what she said, but Anand shyly turned his head and hugged his father's neck. At that moment, for some reason, I felt that a family of 3 should be like this. Ophelia's words, "Is this the result you want with your desperate persistence?" kept repeating in my mind. Is this the result I want? Is it too late to admit that I've done something wrong now? Perhaps I shouldn't have ignored my friend's dissuasion and resolutely decided to keep the child in my belly. Perhaps I shouldn't have left the light off that night. I shouldn't have peeked like a thief at the smile on his face when he looked at Li Shiming. And finally, I shouldn't have been so paranoid as to want to possess him. I always thought that even if I hit a dead end, there would always be a glimmer of hope. I didn't expect that in this world, some feelings wouldn't even give me a moment of pity or a way out. Celine? Are you listening? The receiver kept calling me. I came back to my senses. There was no one under the street lamp over there. I blinked my dry eyes and said, "Okay, I'll consider it. Okay. I'll have dinner with some business partners later. You can come too and get to know some people by the way." Ophelia had an announcement to make later, so we said goodbye at the crossroads. Before leaving, she said that I should think it over carefully by myself. In this huge city, the neon lights were shining lonely, and the sounds of car horns were intertwined, letting the wind blow past my ears. I finally pulled myself together and headed for the place where we were going to have dinner. On the way, I received a message from Aurelius. "Are you back?" I pursed my lips and typed, "I'm busy tonight." After a while, I added, "Have you got home?" This time, he replied quickly, I'll have a social engagement later." Actually, both he and I were quite busy with work and wouldn't deliberately ask about each other's schedules. The car had already arrived at the destination. When I walked into the restaurant, there were men and women sitting at the table. I chatted with the director for a while. An intern from the same department was sitting beside me. "Sister Celine, I haven't added your contact information after working for so long." I understood what he meant. As always, I was friendly and said, "You can scan my QR code." The mobile phones moved up and down, accompanied by a ding sound. A message popped up at the top. "Aurelius, where are you?" Before I could react, the door of the private room was pushed open. The man appeared in front of me like this. The screen of the mobile phone in his palm hadn't gone dark yet. Since Aurelius took over the Aurelius family business, the company's profits had been rising steadily. His ability was obvious to all, and his status in the circle was naturally quite high. In this kind of occasion, he was even more silent. He gave me a light glance and took a seat opposite me. Laughter and flattery continued. "Sister Celine, I've added you. Remember to approve it," the intern said in a voice neither too loud nor too small. I smiled sheepishly and nodded. Out of the corner of my eye, I felt a gaze sweeping over me again. There were not only business partners present but also leaders from the headquarters. The director had drunk a lot and pulled me to toast together. Mr. Wang, regarding this personnel transfer, please take good care of our people here. The man named Mr. Wang smiled and said, sure. He looked at me and said, I heard that Editor-in-Chief Celine isn't married yet. Do you have a boyfriend now? I paused for a moment and subconsciously looked at the opposite side. Aurelius was listening to the people beside him with his eyes lowered. It seemed that everything here had nothing to do with him. The director heard this and preemptively answered for me, not yet. But our editor-in-chief Celine is quite popular in the company and has many suitors. Mr. Wang cheerfully joked that he could tell and said, coincidentally, there are quite a few excellent single young men around me. Maybe we can arrange a blind date. Celine, can I be the matchmaker? I blinked slowly. There was no binding relationship between that person and me at all. I couldn't find a reason to feel guilty, so I said, okay. During the whole meal, I felt like an outsider. I kept my head down and didn't have any eye contact with Aurelius again. Finally, when the dinner was over, I deliberately waited until everyone had left before leaving. After drinking some wine, I shivered all over when the cold wind blew. A black luxury car appeared in my sight. The car window was rolled down, and his voice was deep, get in. Since you've drunk wine, you'd better not drive. Aurelius was quite patient and said, I didn't drink. Even Mr. Wang was persuaded to drink a few more glasses by several business partners at that time. But since Aurelius didn't drink, it was understandable that no one dared to persuade him. If the dinner just now was noisy and unrestrained, now there was only silence and depression in the car. For the first time, I didn't take the initiative to break the silence. In this way, we both had our own thoughts and arrived home all the way. The effect of the alcohol kicked in. I opened the bedroom door and just wanted to rest. As soon as my body touched the bed, I was pulled over. The cold and sharp breath filled my senses. I raised my hand to press against his chest and said, no, I'm tired. Aurelius's eyes were pitch black. He grasped my wrist and pushed it above my head, saying, don't move. He seldom said such straightforward words on this kind of occasion. It wasn't until I felt his fierce strength that I guessed that this man seemed to be angry. But what was he angry about? I frowned and struggled, but I was afraid of waking up the child sleeping in the next room, so I didn't dare to make a loud noise. It hurts. Aurelius finally stopped. He propped his hands beside my ears. With the night light on, his eyebrows were slightly furrowed, and his gaze was like a falling rain curtain. I had never been able to resist him. I would lose even just by looking into his eyes. Trying to avoid his gaze, he suddenly pinched my face, lowered his head, and kissed me. Our lips intertwined, gently rubbing and deepening the kiss, and it became more and more intense. Amid the complicated emotions, I was sober for a moment at a certain time. I was at a loss and let his kisses leave wet marks. Then I fell into the tide again. The next day was the weekend and also the day we promised Anand to go to the amusement park. I didn't wake up until almost noon. There was a glass of water on the bedside table, still steaming. Aurelius hadn't left long ago. After slowly washing up, when I opened the door, I saw a big one and a small one, facing off in the corridor. Aurelius squatted down and touched Anand's head, saying, let Mom sleep a little longer. We'll go to play tomorrow. Anand frowned, unhappy in his heart, but he didn't show it. Was Mom tired last night? This time, Aurelius was left speechless. I couldn't help smiling. The slight noise interrupted the conversation between the father and son. Anand excitedly ran over and said, Mom, we're waiting for you to go to the amusement park. Before setting off, we had lunch at home. Midway through, Auntie came over and chatted with her grandson for a while. Since Aurelius and I weren't married, I had always called her Auntie. Although she asked me to change my way of addressing her, I always felt a bit guilty and didn't do it. The door of the study was closed tightly, so I didn't go to disturb them. Instead, I patiently helped Anand put on some sunscreen. I used to be curious about what they talked about. I remembered once when I was standing outside the study with a cup of tea in my hand. The door was slightly ajar and I heard Auntie say, when do you plan to marry Celine? It's okay if the child is too young to understand, but the girl can't even hold her head up in front of others. I forgot how I managed to leave without showing any emotion at that time. I couldn't blame anyone. Just as he said, this path was chosen by me. Now that I think about it, I feel a sense of relief instead. The director called again and asked me how I was thinking about it. I held my mobile phone and gently traced the cheek of the child in front of me with my fingertips. I felt that it was time. I said in a low voice, "Well, I'll go." The door outside opened and closed, and Auntie left. Aurelius' expression was no different from usual. When he saw me, he said, "Go and change into a thicker one." I was wearing a light woolen coat. "It's not cold today." He didn't say anything more. In the end, he still took a shawl and put it in the car. Because the child was too young, we didn't play any extreme amusement projects. Instead, we mainly interacted and took pictures with dolls. Even so, the little one was already very satisfied. It's said that before two people part completely, there will be a dreamlike pleasant moment. In the evening, Aurelius took Annan to ride the carousel and then came back. Under the afterglow of the setting sun, I subconsciously took out my mobile phone to take a picture. Annan said something that I didn't hear clearly. Aurelius smiled slightly and raised his eyes, but his gaze fell behind me. I turned around following his eyes and saw Li Shiming standing in the distance. "Aurelius, long time no see." She walked over gracefully, with exquisite makeup on her face. After all these years, she still looked the same as she did in college. Aurelius frowned. "Why are you here?" "So it's quite a coincidence," Li Shiming said with a smile. I stood between the two of them and couldn't even bring myself to take a step to leave. It wasn't until Annan said that he wanted to ride the carousel again that I said, "Mom will take you there." I almost blurted it out eagerly. Aurelius called out to me, "Celine." I turned around. He looked at me with a depth in his eyes that I couldn't understand. "Be careful." Annan pulled me towards the carousel, and I nodded silently. Watching the two of them walk away, Aurelius then withdrew his gaze. "On purpose? Your itinerary isn't hard to find out." "What, did I bother you? Last time on the roadside, I told you not to show up in front of me again." Li Shiming raised her eyebrows and said indifferently, "Aren't you still unmarried? Even if I pursue you again, I haven't done anything wrong." Aurelius' eyes showed a bit of impatience. "Do you know what breaking up means? It's impossible. The regrets or grudges from our youth should have stayed in the past long ago." He hadn't let anyone down in his life except for Celine that night. He felt guilty about it. But things always developed in a dramatic way. After he finished speaking, Li Shiming could hardly keep her smile. After a while, she said, "Aurelius, actually, we're the same kind of people." She said, "Back then, I asked you to go abroad with me, but you thought going abroad wouldn't help you take over the company. We both dislike being restrained and forced. So when you found out that Celine had lied to you, you hesitated to marry her. Were you unable to get over the hurdle in your heart, or were you waiting for me to come back?" Aurelius had been about to leave. Hearing this, he paused slightly and turned his head with his thin lips slightly parted. At that moment, Li Shiming's face froze. It was a quarter of an hour later when Aurelius came to find me. I was sensible enough not to ask anything. Annan was also tired and didn't continue strolling around. On the way back, he suddenly asked, "What do you want for your birthday next month?" Because of the red light, he stopped the car, as if waiting for an answer. In previous years on my birthday, he would also ask like this. I would always say softly that anything would be okay. Now I calmly turned my head and looked aimlessly at the light rain outside the window. I wanted to say that I didn't want anything, but what came out of my mouth was still, "Anything is okay." In the following few days, the application for job transfer was approved. I was busy finishing and handing over the work at hand and often worked overtime. Once, the department held a temporary meeting, which took up some time. When Aurelius called, the meeting had just ended. After saying a few words to my colleagues beside me, I walked to the end of the corridor to answer the phone. "When will you get off work?" he asked. The floor wasn't high, and there was a floor-to-ceiling window in front of me. Looking down at the busy traffic outside, I was silent for a moment and then said, "It might be very late." There was the sound of wind in the receiver, and his voice came slowly like grains of sand. "I'll come to pick you up." "No, you take good care of Anan." Someone called me from behind, so I hurriedly said a few more words and hung up, then turned around to get back to work. The cold wind was biting. No one knew that there was a figure leaning against the car body downstairs, staring at the turned-off screen in a daze. 3 days later, Aurelius was going on a business trip to Germany. Last night, I was also working overtime, but it was the last time. Finally, all the work was settled. His flight was in the morning, and I got up early to see him off. Aurelius put on his coat and, thinking of something, lifted his eyelids to look at me. "I'll bring you a gift when I come back." Anan heard it and hugged his calf, looking up. "I want one too. Daddy, give me a hug. Come back early to play with me." Aurelius smiled helplessly and bent down to respond to the little one's coquetry. "Okay, be good. Daddy should also give Mommy a hug." I stood beside them. Hearing this, I subconsciously wanted to find a reason to change the topic. But then he leaned over and kissed the corner of my mouth. "You be good too." I couldn't tell if it was out of tenderness or just playing the part of an affectionate couple in front of the child. For some reason, I instinctively thought it was the latter. Until Aurelius left, my mind was full of the warmth of the moment when he leaned over. That day, after I sent Anan to class, I turned around at the intersection and went back to my parents' house. Because I got pregnant willfully that year, my father had been so angry that he didn't talk to me. When he saw Aurelius, he didn't have a good look on his face either. However, having worked for the Aurelius family for half of his life, the older generation of the Aurelius family had already regarded my parents as their own relatives. At afternoon tea, my father still didn't talk to me and went straight to the study. My mother smiled to ease the tension. Men care about their face. "He knew you liked the desserts from this store, so he brought them back specially this morning." I nodded gently. Looking at the beautifully decorated packaging box, I suddenly felt a bit teary-eyed. "Mom, if I said I wanted to break up with Aurelius, would you scold me?" Those scenes from years ago when I had heated arguments with my parents because I wanted to keep the child were still vivid in my mind. As parents, would they think I was being childish now? My mother seemed to have guessed that this day would come. The smile on her lips didn't change. "There are some things that no one can persuade you about. Only when you experience them yourself will you know to turn back. Mom won't blame you. I can only say that you and Aurelius don't have that kind of fate." During these 3 years, I hadn't had any sense of security. The repressed emotions in my heart seemed to find an outlet at this moment. I thought I would always cry bitterly for that person, but I just shed tears so restrainedly. "Mom, I don't know why I've become like this. Some people say that only those who grow up lonely and lacking love will be desperate for love when they grow up. But clearly, I'm not like that. Clearly, I grew up with my parents' love. Why did I become so paranoid for one person?" My sobs were faint. My mother gently patted my back and wiped my tears for me. "Okay, you look like a little cat with your face all smeared with tears. There's nothing wrong with loving someone. Besides, our Celine is much braver than many people. Mom should praise you instead." That day, in front of my family, I seemed to turn back into a child who could cry and make mistakes and then admit them without any scruples. Before I knew it, it was time to pick Anan up from class. Before leaving, I said that I had decided to work in the neighboring city. My mother showed full support. "Tell your father about it, or his bad temper will flare up again and he'll blame you." In the study, my father looked at the documents coldly and still didn't say a word. Just when I had waited for a long time and was about to sigh and turn around, he raised his eyes. "Come back for the spring festival." I smiled with teary eyes and said okay. On the way back home in the evening, I bought a new toy for Anan. The little one had a great time playing with it and finally fell asleep. I went back to the empty master bedroom. That night, I hardly slept at all. Like this, I spent 2 or 3 days packing my clothes while spending more time with Anan. Finally, on an afternoon at the end of January, I kissed the child's cheek. Mom is also going on a business trip. Eat well at home, okay? Anand was playing with the new building blocks. I know, Mom. You also eat well. The child didn't understand the meaning of separation at all. I watched him for a while longer before leaving. The precious gifts given by that person and the bank card he gave me out of guilt at the beginning, I left them all in the big house. I didn't lose out. In this life, having a cute and sensible child was enough for me. I had been hesitating whether to contact Aurelius or not, but unexpectedly, he contacted me first. What are you busy with? Nothing much. I asked, is there anything? It was very quiet on his end. There was still the sound of a door closing. He probably just got back to the hotel from a dinner party. Aurelius said, you didn't call me. I thought something had happened to you. In the past, when this person was on a business trip, I would always take in to make video or voice calls to him. I even had the nerve to ask if there were other women around him. Of course, these seemingly sweet scenes disappeared without a trace as I became more and more worried about gains and losses day by day. I took a deep breath and found my voice again. I've been transferred to work in City Z. This sentence fell lightly, and what followed was a long silence. He should have guessed something, but he still asked, when will you come back? I think I'll settle down there. My tone was fairly calm. Aurelius seemed to hear something funny. What do you mean? I stared at the scenery passing by outside the car window of Aurelius. Actually, I should say sorry to you. I couldn't remember exactly what I was sorry for. I only knew that if there hadn't been the child, perhaps there wouldn't have been any intersection between him and me. The call was silent again. I heard the sound of a lighter. Aurelius seldom smoked. At least he had never smoked a single cigarette at home. After a long while. Celine, why do you think you can decide everything for others with just one sentence, and then you think you can just wipe the slate clean by saying sorry at the end? His voice was gloomy. I pursed my lips and couldn't argue back. I could only say in a muffled voice, so while there's still time, it's better for both of us this way. Whether it's selfish or not, our entanglement started in a flustered way. For this ending, I wanted to be more decent. Aurelius seemed to be suppressing something. He slowly exhaled the smoke. After a few seconds, he asked, what about the child? Don't you want him anymore? No, I'll come back to see him often. I had thought everything through. The distance between here and City Z was a 2-hour drive. Even though it's not very convenient to travel back and forth, as long as I'm free every week, I'll come back to see him. In this way, I won't miss Anand's growth. After saying this, through the phone, I couldn't see Aurelius' expression. I only heard him suddenly say softly, what about me? It felt like I was having an illusion, so I asked, what? Before I got a response, the car had already arrived at the station. I didn't want to take up the driver's time, so I said goodbye over the phone and ended the call. That day, although it was cold, the sky was clear. The social news department of the headquarters has 3 groups. I was parachuted in to serve as the chief editor of News Group 3. Since I was new here, there were many things that I needed to get to know again. The working atmosphere wasn't as relaxed as that in the branch office either, but I would get used to it over time. Fortunately, I got to know several colleagues and we could have pleasant conversations. One of them was named Theodore. I heard that he had some connections. His father sent him here to experience the hardships of working because he was idle and did nothing all day. However, he seemed to enjoy it. Every time when it was time to eat, he would drag me to the cafeteria together. It was getting colder and colder. I got up late in the morning and randomly put on a coat. Only when I went outside did I feel the cold. Even when I was having a video call with Anand, my voice sounded nasal. Mommy, Daddy just got home. When will you come back? The project that Aurelius went to Germany for cooperation this time was of great importance. He wouldn't be able to come back until New Year's Eve at the earliest, but unexpectedly, he came back early. The man took my mobile phone. He was still wearing a suit. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to describe him as looking travel-worn, yet his features were still handsome and refined. For a moment, I felt a bit embarrassed. Subconsciously, I turned the camera away from myself. Have you caught a cold? He asked. It's not serious. Let me talk to Anan, I replied. The meaning was obvious. Aurelius held the phone and looked at the screen, which only showed the background of the room. After a moment of silence, he still handed the phone to the child. Anan looked innocent. Mommy, come back quickly, he whispered. Daddy is so scary. I couldn't help but smile. I was about to say something when everything went black in front of my eyes. When I woke up, I was already in the hospital. Theodore finally let out a sigh of relief. Editor-in-Chief Celine, fortunately, you fainted in the office and were discovered in time. Otherwise, the consequences would have been unimaginable. He was exaggerating. I moved my body a little. Thank you. Don't mention it. By the way, you're anemic and you don't eat on time. You don't take your health seriously at all. I was stunned for a moment. Perhaps when I was with Anan before, I had regular meals. Now that I'm alone, I eat casually. It was the first time that I realized I was anemic. The door of the ward wasn't closed. When Theodore helped me sit up, Aurelius happened to appear there. He was still wearing the suit as in the video, with his tie loose. His silent gaze swept over the hand on my shoulder. Theodore looked at the man in front of him and thought he looked familiar. Then he suddenly realized, isn't this President Aurelius? Editor-in-Chief Celine, you too. When I first arrived at the headquarters, many colleagues from different departments asked me if I was married. I didn't want to pretend anymore and directly said that I had a child. Now that Theodore knew Aurelius, everything became clear. Aurelius seemed not to hear what he was saying and walked closer. Are you feeling better? The other person's aura was too cold. Theodore touched the back of his neck and said, you two talk. I'll leave in a hurry. Then he left quickly. Only the two of us were left in the room, and it became so quiet that only the sound of breathing could be heard. I casually asked, why are you here? Aurelius flipped through my medical record. I was worried. I didn't understand. Didn't Anan want to come with you? It's too late. He has to go to school tomorrow. Oh. Silence fell again. I still had an intravenous drip in my hand. I let him transfer me to a VIP ward. The man didn't seem to have any intention of leaving. Or rather, he wanted to stay in the hospital to accompany me for the night. You can go back. I don't need you here. Aurelius put a glass of water beside me. That person is okay, right? Which person? Only then did I realize that he was referring to Theodore. There was confusion in my eyes. You're being strange today. Only the nanny is at home accompanying Anan. You? Someone knocked on the door of the ward, interrupting our conversation. The assistant brought some documents and a notebook. Aurelius should be very busy with work. He took them and turned to me. It's okay. I asked Mom to take care of him tonight. All the reasons for me to refuse were blocked. I secretly kept silent. Late at night, under the light of a bedside lamp, I heard the faint sound of typing on the keyboard. I tossed and turned and couldn't fall asleep. I had never thought of cutting off contact with Aurelius. After all, we had a child. However, under this seemingly open and aboveboard situation, I never expected that this person would take the initiative to appear in front of me. Probably sensing my gaze, Aurelius put down the notebook and came over to touch my forehead. Are you not feeling well? I shook my head and avoided his touch. After hesitating for a moment, I said, is it like when you went to the hospital to see Li Shimeng? After saying that, I was stunned. Why did I bring up the old thing again? It's different. Aurelius sat beside me and said slowly, the company also had something to deal with that day. After finishing it, I only met her in the corridor of the hospital. He had never said these words at that time. He let me guess and left me at a loss in my speculations. I subconsciously smiled and sighed. Aurelius, being with someone like you is really tiring. Aurelius didn't say anything. Sleepiness hit me. I turned over again. In a half-awake and half-asleep state, I heard him say, I'll change. The next day, I went through the discharge procedures. I didn't go home but went directly to the company. Aurelius sent me to downstairs of the company. I had been thinking all the way. Finally, after the car stopped steadily, I made everything clear. In the future, if it's not about the child, we'd better not meet each other. Without waiting for his answer, I opened the door and got out of the car. Perhaps I would never forget him in my life, nor would I forget that experience, nor that brave love when I put all my eggs in one basket. But since I had decided to part, I wouldn't look back. As soon as I arrived at the office, many colleagues came to show their concern. When everyone had left, Theodore came over. I'm really tight-lipped. I didn't tell anyone. Am I nice enough? He had a pair of peach blossom eyes and raised his eyebrows like a buddy. My mobile phone beside me lit up. Aurelius, eat on time. I took a casual look at it and then looked up and smiled. So, have you finished writing yesterday's manuscript? Theodore's expression relaxed and he complained pitifully, is this how you treat your savior? Chief editor, could you be a bit more lenient and give me half a day more? I joked with him for a few words. All right. Finish it and hand it to me as soon as possible. Sure. Days passed uneventfully like this. Of course, except that I would receive well-arranged nutritious meals at every mealtime. There was no need to guess who arranged it. I sent a message to question him, but Aurelius only replied with, it's okay. It was like punching cotton. I didn't bother about it anymore. If he wanted to send them, let him do it. During that period, as the Spring Festival was approaching, I was supposed to go home for the new year. However, an extremely serious murder case occurred locally. The situation was so serious that we received an urgent notice from above to work overtime during the Spring Festival. Today was just 2 days away from New Year's Eve. I had just finished explaining to my parents when Anand also called. The little one didn't look very natural. His big round black eyes glanced at the person beside him and he said sweetly, Mommy, I miss you so much. I happened to have a rare break at that time and teased him casually. Really? How much do you miss me? Anand looked at the person beside him again and shrank his neck shyly. As much as Daddy misses Mommy. The smile that was about to come out froze on my lips. But I couldn't say anything in front of the child. Mommy will go back in 2 days, okay? Anand nodded obediently and the phone was then handed back to Aurelius. He said in a deep voice, it'll be New Year's Eve that day. Yeah, I'm really busy with work. Indeed, I was really busy. I couldn't even make it back. On New Year's Eve, I followed the team to the crime scene for an interview. In the afternoon, Aurelius called. Where are you? He paused for a moment. Anand asked when you'll be home. The wind was strong. I pulled my collar tighter. There's something urgent. I can't make it back. I'll go to see him tomorrow. The work came up suddenly and many things were out of my control. Looking at the crying family members of the victim, I really couldn't bear not to edit the situation overnight and make it public. It was noisy here. I didn't hear what was said on the other end of the phone. What did you say? I didn't hear you. Aurelius' voice became a bit louder yet he said gently, I said, take good care of yourself. I didn't take this little episode to heart. When I returned to the company after finishing work when it got dark, the matter was still not over. The computer was on, and the keyboard and mouse were constantly in use. On this day when families were reunited, the news building was brightly lit. Theodore treated the whole team to coffee and also bought hot pot, which was regarded as a reunion dinner. When the time pointed to 10 o'clock, I got off work with my colleagues. Theodore stretched himself and said that he would give me a ride. I shook my head and said, no need. It only takes 5 minutes to get to my home from here. Then be careful on the way. Let us know in the group when you get home. Hearing this, several colleagues joked one after another, President Theodore, are you chasing Editor-in-Chief Celine? As soon as these words were spoken, Theodore's face turned red immediately. Can't it be just the care between friends? You guys also let us know in the group when you get home, okay? Oh. But you didn't say you'd give us a ride. Theodore couldn't stay any longer and just left in a hurry. The colleagues around me also left in 2s and 3s. I stood there for a while, glanced at the time, and then when I looked up again, I was suddenly stunned. On New Year's Eve, Thousands of lights were twinkling in countless households. On the sparsely populated roadside, Aurelius was leaning against the car alone. Under the street lamp, he seemed so distant and illusory, like a lonely shadow. This man had also brought Annan with him. The child had already fallen asleep in the car. And I could only ask, "Why are you here?" Aurelius didn't know how long he had been standing there. Perhaps he had heard all the conversation between me and my colleagues just now. "I wanted to spend your birthday with you." Only then did I remember that today was also my birthday. We were speechless, facing each other. When we arrived downstairs at my home, I walked ahead to open the door, and Aurelius came in with the sleeping Annan in his arms. I rented a small apartment. Thinking that Annan might come to live here, I specially bought a children's bed for the second bedroom. Now with Aurelius here, there was nowhere to put him. "There's no extra room. Anyway, you'll leave tomorrow. Just make do on the sofa for one night." Aurelius hummed in agreement and said, "Is that boy your colleague?" I didn't have the mood to answer him. As soon as I charged my mobile phone, several calls from Aurelius in the past few hours popped up. In an instant, my temper flared up. I lowered my voice and said, "Aurelius, you didn't used to act so recklessly. What if I wasn't at the company? Would you just wait downstairs with Annan at night?" Aurelius didn't respond. Instead, he still asked, "So does that guy like you?" "It's none of your business whether he likes me or not. I'm asking you a question." Because of my movement, a few strands of hair fell on my cheeks. He raised his hand and tucked my hair behind my ear, saying, "Don't be angry." With this simple action, my heart skipped a beat, and my heart was filled with bitterness. "What on earth do you want?" Aurelius's fingertips obviously paused for a few seconds. He smiled bitterly and said, "I don't know if you still want it or not." At some point, there was a box in his hand. He gently opened it, and a ring was lying inside. "I ordered it in Germany. I wanted to give it to you as a birthday present." His tone was deep and sounded as stiff as a puppet on strings. "Happy birthday." The design of the diamond ring was simple and elegant. The faint glints of light from it were so dazzling that it made my eyes ache. I couldn't help but feel like laughing. "What do you mean? Didn't you hate me? Didn't you refuse to marry me?" My eyes suddenly turned red, and I stared straight at him. "Why didn't you stick to it? Why did you do this only after I made up my mind to leave?" "Aurelius, I've apologized to you. I know I was wrong. You've made me suffer enough in these 3 years. Why did you?" He was quite tall. When he bent down to hug me, all my senses were filled with his presence. My heart trembled slightly. He said softly, word by word, "Yes, at first, I was unwilling. How could there be such a silly person who deliberately got pregnant just to get married? But later, he always thought that after so many years of getting along, he had let this girl gradually seep into his life. If the ending wouldn't change, then why should he care about some details anymore?" Aurelius was silent for a few seconds, and his voice became hoarse. "Celine, are you still willing?" Finally, he turned around to look at me. But those lonely and hard days were like a lingering shadow of fear. I never wanted to experience them again. Fireworks flashed in the dark night outside the house, followed by the sound of firecrackers. A new year had come. I looked away and said, "I just want to accompany Annan to grow up. As for the rest, forget it." Neither of us slept well that night. Before leaving, the gradually dimming light in the man's eyes was still vivid in my mind. I buried my head in the quilt and finally fell asleep with difficulty. On the first day of the Lunar New Year, I was woken up by Annan's laughter outside the house. Breakfast was laid on the table. Since I couldn't cook and sometimes the nanny wasn't around, Aurelius would cook by himself. Presumably, his cooking skills had gradually improved. "Mom, congratulations on getting rich." Annan had changed into new clothes and hugged me with his whole arm. I smiled sleepily and went back to the room to take out a red envelope for him. "You're so sweet." Aurelius pulled out a chair. There was no longer the gloom on his face from last night. "Come and have breakfast first." I sat at the table with Annan in my arms, and a red envelope was also handed to me. Annan clapped his hands happily. "Mom has a red envelope just like me." I glanced at the man and said, "No need. I'm not a child anymore." Aurelius smiled slightly and said, "Who says you're not?" He explained, "It's for good luck. Just take it." I didn't say anything more. Later, on the way to Taken to my grandmother's house, I kept chatting with my son to amuse him. Aurelius didn't mind. It was just that before I got out of the car, he couldn't help but hold my wrist. "Celine, I was serious about what I said last night." My fingertips subconsciously clenched for a moment. After a while, I said, "I was serious too." The old lady was naturally happy to see her grandson. In this way, the whole spring festival ended in a lively atmosphere. I deliberately chose a time when Aurelius went to the company and sent Anand to his villa. It was not until I returned to my apartment in City Z that I saw the ring on the coffee table. Aurelius hadn't taken it away. I picked it up and looked at it for a while. Finally, I put it in a hidden drawer. During that period of time, meals were still delivered to the company on time. Aurelius often brought the child to find me. It was as funny as if he was coming to take his runaway wife home. I saw all this, and I couldn't describe how I felt in my heart. The only good thing was that it saved me the trouble of running back and forth, and I could often see Anand. My best friend Ophelia also had some small troubles during this period. It all started from the casting of a TV series. Originally, she was supposed to play the female lead, but she was replaced by a star with powerful backstage resources. Her fans were in an uproar, and everyone thought that this was a done deal. But Aurelius secretly gave her a helping hand. Needless to say, it was obvious whose face he was doing it for. For this reason, Ophelia specifically came to ask me, "What's going on between you two? Is Aurelius crazy?" I couldn't help laughing when I heard this. "Nothing's going on. This role was originally yours. He probably just couldn't stand it. Do you believe what you just said yourself?" Aurelius hated the affairs in the entertainment industry the most. Once, a female star, in order to get on the hot search, was photographed coming out of the same hotel as him. At that time, I had just given birth to Anna not long ago. When I heard this rumor, I ignored him for several days. But later, the truth was revealed. That female star had deliberately inquired about his schedule and pretended to come out of the same hotel with him. As a result, she was directly blocked. That night, I took the initiative to hug him again. Aurelius just smiled and said, "No more tantrums?" Suddenly remembering these memories that should have faded away in the past, I felt even more irritable. Now, because of Ophelia's matter, the rumors on the internet were still spreading, and people even started to guess the relationship between her and Aurelius. This made Ophelia directly use her official account to post on Weibo to explain, "Thanks for asking, but please don't mention me." President Aurelius is busy chasing the mother of his child while crying bitterly. With just this one sentence, it directly dominated the hot search list. Looking at this exaggerated and bold statement, I just felt speechless. One thing at a time. I still called Aurelius. After thinking for a long time, I said sincerely, "Ophelia didn't mean that." Aurelius chuckled for a moment on the phone. "What she said is also right." With this confusing sentence, I suppressed the fluctuations in my mood and said, "Goodbye. I'll come to see you tomorrow." Thinking that he would bring his son with him, I hummed in agreement and hung up. Unfortunately, the next day, at my doorstep, I only saw him alone. "Where's Anand?" Aurelius slowly straightened up and said, "He has new toys and doesn't want to come." I didn't believe this at all. "Is it that he doesn't want to come or that you tricked him by saying it's not to see me?" Aurelius silently curved his lips and said, "I've been standing here for more than 3 hours. Serves you right." I ignored him and opened the door to go inside. At this time, my mobile phone vibrated. Theodore in the group was calling for us to have midnight snacks together. I agreed. "If you have nothing to do, you can leave." "Are you going out?" I didn't hide it and said, "Going to a gathering." He looked at my hand typing on the phone and emotions flashed in his eyes. "I'll give you a ride." "No need. It's okay. I deserve it." This man got angry inexplicably, just like that night when he kissed Celine forcefully. It couldn't be explained. By the roadside, Aurelius opened the car door and the driver I called on my mobile phone also stopped beside us. I slowly broke free from his hand with a serious look on my face. Really, there's no need. Go back. Celine. He murmured my name softly. The car door was shut mercilessly. I didn't respond and got into the taxi. Through the rearview mirror, I saw the man standing alone and lonely by the roadside until his figure became smaller and smaller. My heart wasn't as calm as it seemed on the surface. My mind was in a mess. I also drank a few more glasses at the dinner gathering. Theodore knew about my relationship with Aurelius. He carefully walked over with a wine bottle in his hand and asked, "Sister, have you made up with President Aurelius?" He was actually the same age as me. Because he liked to be lazy at work, he often acted coquettishly and called me sister, asking me to postpone the submission time. Now I was kind of used to it. My head was dizzy. I shook my head vigorously and said, "Nothing of the sort." I don't know why, but suddenly I thought of what Aurelius said, "I deserve it." Is it true that people are born incomplete and spend their whole lives looking for the missing part? Some people make the wrong choice, some people make the right one, and there are still some people who are so foolish as to want to turn the wrong one into the right one. I forgot how many more glasses of wine I drank after that. I only remembered the wind in my ears and remembered Theodore awkwardly saying, "Isn't this the ex-husband? Why is he standing by the roadside?" "No, sister, what should I call the father of your child?" The liquor spilled onto the bedding. I didn't open my eyes all along. Feeling uncomfortable, I hiccuped from the alcohol. Then my body was lifted up, and someone was feeding me water. For a moment, my thoughts went blank. When I came to my senses again, I was mumbling, "Theodore. Don't shake. Come? Drink." The hand that was gently wiping my face suddenly stopped. For a long time. I was almost falling asleep when I heard a suppressed low voice, "Yeah, drink." I tried hard to open my eyes, but all I could see was a blurry shadow. So I gave up and finally fell asleep. I had many dreams that night, but when I woke up, I couldn't remember what exactly I had dreamed about. The door was opened. Aurelius looked like he hadn't slept all night. There was a bit of tiredness under his eyes. He handed me the hangover tea and asked, "Are you still feeling uncomfortable?" With a hangover, all my nerves were slow to react. My palms were warm, and for a moment, I didn't know what to say. "It was you last night." Aurelius looked down at me and said, "Who else did you think it was?" I didn't answer and calmly brought the cup to my lips. "You should go back. Anna needs you." All kinds of emotions filled his eyes, but in the end, he suppressed them all. Aurelius looked away and said, "I'll accompany you to have something to eat." When he left, I finally relaxed and rubbed my temples. I couldn't believe I had slept until the afternoon. Even though I had a memory lapse, I could still remember some scenes. I silently lowered my head and couldn't help staring blankly at the cup in my hand. That was probably the most peaceful meal that Aurelius and I had together since we separated. "I have a meeting in the afternoon." I didn't take it seriously and said, "Go ahead." Aurelius wanted to ask something, but in the end, it all turned into helplessness. Maybe it was what I deserved, kicking away the ladder after crossing the river? Hearing these words, I thought of last night again. "I didn't ask you to take care of me." Just then, my mobile phone rang. I glanced at the note and walked to the balcony to answer the call. Theodore also drank too much last night. He accidentally fell when going up the steps at home. Now he was lying in the hospital with a cast on. "As an exchange, since I took you to the hospital last time, don't you think you should come to see me this time?" Hearing his aggrieved tone, I thought about it and realized he was right. "Okay, I'll come right away." When I came back, the dining table had been tidied up. Aurelius saw me pick up my bag and asked, "Are you going out again?" I hummed in response, "A friend is injured and in the hospital." "Is it Theodore? Are you going to accompany him?" I didn't like his tone. "Yeah, he's alone." I was just about to open the door. My wrist was pulled over, and my back was pressed against the door panel. I looked up and met the man's eyes that no longer hid his emotions. "What about me?" His voice was cold and low, as if he was talking to himself. Aurelius held my hand, and all his emotions were no longer concealed. I also want you to accompany me. Maybe because he hadn't slept all night, his eyes were slightly bloodshot. Then he tentatively asked, "Could you please not go?" His hoarse voice hit my heart, and for a moment, I felt my throat choked up and my eyes became red. "Aurelius, you're just not used to me not being in your life now. It's just reluctance." Aurelius shook his head and interrupted me, "No." The strength in his hand tightened and then relaxed. He said, "Celine, I can't live without you." That's why he minded when she exchanged contact information with other men, minded when she agreed to go on a blind date, and minded when other men sent her home. All these things, through cause and effect along the way, and at this moment, he didn't even have the right to ask her to stay. The man's gaze was downcast. I didn't know what he was thinking. I couldn't stay any longer, so I pushed him away directly, looking overly calm. "I'm leaving." Finally, the suffocating feeling in my heart gradually disappeared. I concealed all my emotions and pushed open the door of the ward. Theodore had his leg propped up and said with a smile, "I thought you weren't coming." I put down the fruits I had bought casually. I've never seen anyone with a sprained ankle still in such a good mood. "Well, it's because I've seen you now. After such a long time, as adults, we could actually see the implications behind his attentiveness. Theodore, I have a child." The expression of the person on the hospital bed froze for a moment. "I know. What does that have to do with the fact that I like you?" I couldn't help laughing and shook my head. "Let's put it this way. I don't plan to fall in love or get married in the future." Theodore didn't say anything else, and the smile on his face just now disappeared completely. Seeing him suddenly become silent, I sighed. Maybe I misunderstood something. "We're friends, aren't we?" Theodore still didn't say anything, just like a child. "If you don't say anything, I won't pay attention to you anymore." He finally turned his head. "What are you doing? As a friend, don't you even have the patience to visit me? Many things could make both of us more relaxed when we were just friends." I stayed with him for most of the afternoon. Before leaving, Theodore asked, "Do you still love him?" I stopped in my tracks. Many things aren't just about love or not, the road has come to this point. Maybe between Aurelius and me, there's more about responsibility. I used to be good at deceiving myself. I deceived myself into thinking that even without love, as long as I gave, I could surely move heaven and earth. People often say that if the ending isn't satisfactory, it must be a tragedy. But it was never a tragedy between Aurelius and me. From the years since I met him until now, everything I've felt, whether painful or happy, I've never regretted. How can something you don't regret be called a tragedy? Seeing that I was silent, Theodore cleared his throat, and his tone was unnatural. "I understand you, so don't rush to make a conclusion. I liked you at first sight, Sister Celine." I smiled gently. "But I don't need to use one man to forget another man. It wouldn't be fair to anyone." When I came out of the hospital, it was already evening. I didn't hurry home and just walked aimlessly along the roadside. Also at this time, in this strange city, I ran into Li Shiming by chance. Instead of finding a coffee shop to sit down, we just stood facing each other on the roadside. When Aurelius was with her before, I seldom bothered them. But because we were in the same university and occasionally bumped into each other, as if it was a woman's instinct, I would unconsciously observe her. "I heard that you and Aurelius separated. Did you really think you could make a difference? Don't you plan to continue occupying what doesn't belong to you?" She was also observing me. In the past, although I cared about her past with Aurelius, I had never thought of confronting her. No one is an object, and the word compete would inevitably seem vulgar in reality. At this moment, I smiled. "Am I the cuckoo and you the magpie? You came back to China and found that without a good background, you still couldn't find a good job. Finally, you realized that it would have been easier to just be Mrs. Aurelius from the beginning, right? People are all the same, always wanting more. Including me." Li Shiming's gaze turned slightly cold. Instead of getting angry when being exposed, she smiled. "Aurelius didn't give me a chance either." I didn't say anything. There was nothing more to say. Li Shiming looked at the sky. This wasn't a TV drama. She wouldn't act like a vicious person and keep meddling again and again. She had her own pride. In her heart, giving up interests for love was the stupidest thing to do. Maybe she just went with the flow. In this era, love and interests are always bundled together, forgetting that there are still people who live just for the purest love. Celine, actually, I quite admire you. Do you know the reason why he rejected me? Winter has passed and spring has come, the sun and the moon alternate, and now it's already early summer. In this world, nothing will change whether someone leaves or not. Unfortunately, greed and hatred turn into different forms and disrupt the world of mortals. Li Shiming left, and I stood on the roadside, with her last words lingering in my mind. Aurelius told me that even though there were some dishonorable things between you two, he had never thought of marrying anyone else in his life. I arrived home in a daze. I thought Aurelius had left. He couldn't cook elaborate dishes. Most of what he cooked were simple home-cooked meals. Just like no matter how many psychological barriers there were, in these 3 years between him and me, life just went on like this. Didn't you say you had a meeting? Aurelius came out of the kitchen. He wasn't wearing an apron, and the cuffs of his shirt were rolled up. His noble and indifferent temperament didn't fit in with this domestic atmosphere at all. It's not that important. It's been postponed. When he felt uncomfortable, he always avoided looking into my eyes. He didn't look at me at this moment either. Suddenly, thunder rumbled outside the house, and heavy rain poured down. For some reason, I had the urge to cry again, but not because of him. My mother said that I was braver than many people. So I bravely decided on someone, disregarding worldly opinions and throwing myself into it wholeheartedly. Later, I bravely pulled away and wouldn't let my emotions be affected by this person anymore. Now I was crying for my own barely noticeable wavering under this resolute decision. My tears were wiped away. Aurelius rubbed my cheek and said, "Don't cry. I didn't plan to stay. I'll leave in a while." I let him misunderstand and glanced out of the window. It's raining heavily. Leave tomorrow. Aurelius hung his hands down and his Adam's apple moved. Okay. The living room wasn't big and the sofa wasn't spacious either. It wouldn't be comfortable to sleep on. Maybe he hardly slept every time. That night I laid a floor mat in the bedroom and threw a quilt on it. I didn't talk to him all along, and Aurelius also lay down quietly. Neither of us fell asleep. What happened? He asked. Nothing. Since I came back I seemed to be in a bad mood. He probably guessed that I had been wronged outside. Did that man bully you? Aurelius turned over. Even though I couldn't see his face, I could tell that his eyes were cold. I couldn't help laughing. No, go to sleep. Aurelius finally fell silent. All I could hear was the pattering rain hitting the windowsill. I looked soberly at the dark night and his voice reached my ears again. Celine, if you want to be with someone else, I can't stop you, he said in a deep voice. But, before that, could you please give me one more chance? His tone was almost pleading. But this game wasn't just about him. It was like a deadlock and I was also at fault. Yet he was the one saying to give him one more chance. I didn't know how to react. Even my clear mind became confused. Life is too long. I don't know. I didn't know how many times I needed to be brave to make my life worthwhile. Aurelius hummed in response. Life is long. I'll wait for you slowly. My life got back on track again. Running around everywhere for the truth. Still busy, still fulfilled. Over the years, Aurelius had protected my private life very well. One day, I don't know which female star on the internet was rumored to be Anand's mother. The Aurelius family group also promptly issued a clarification notice. I just glanced at this kind of baseless rumor. However, I received a message from Aurelius. As if he was afraid that I hadn't seen it, he specially sent me the picture of that notice. I replied with just, With work at hand, I thought I would forget about it, but I was distracted several times. Later during that period, I often went home exhausted. Sometimes Aurelius would wait for me in the car with Anand. Sometimes the father and son would wait downstairs, and sometimes the two of them would stand in front of the apartment door waiting for me. Once, I got home more than an hour late after working overtime. I couldn't help saying, "I'll go back on the weekend." "Why did you rush over here?" "I was busy writing a news article that day and didn't have time to go with them." Aurelius sent me a few photos of the child. I asked, "Do you always do what the child says? It's so tiring to come and go like this." I wanted to. He smiled at me and his gaze was as gentle as when we first met. Hearing these words, I unconsciously paused for a moment. I remembered that he went on a business trip to Hong Kong last week and took Annan to Disneyland by the way. I was busy writing a news article that day and didn't have time to go with them. Aurelius sent me a few photos of the child. I asked him if it was fun and if Annan was happy. He only replied with a few words, I missed you very much." At this moment, Aurelius was also used to my lack of response. He wasn't the kind of person who liked to say sweet words. He was even a bit dull. After settling the child down, he just followed behind me and asked, "Have you had dinner?" "Yes." After saying that, I accidentally bumped my leg against the corner of the table and my body tilted to one side for a moment. Aurelius held my waist to help me stand firmly. Instinctively, I grasped his collar with my hand, leaving wrinkles on it. "Thank you." However, Aurelius didn't let go of me. He helped me sit down and gently rubbed my calf. "Are you hurt?" He knelt on one knee, looked up at me, and his eyes were bright. He really had a pair of eyes that looked gentle to everyone. At the same time, the door of the inner room was opened. Annan rubbed his sleepy eyes. "Daddy, I'm hungry. Is Mommy back?" That night, Aurelius cooked noodles, watching Annan eating with great relish. I also took a few bites. The atmosphere was strangely warm. Anan's eyes wandered around and he hugged my arm. "Mommy." I hummed in response and wiped his mouth for him. "What's the matter?" The little one smiled slyly. "When can Daddy take you home?" These words wouldn't come out of a 3-year-old child's mouth. It was obvious that someone had taught him. The man didn't eat much and slowly lowered his head to drink water. Probably sensing my gaze, the corners of his lips curved for a moment. I didn't teach him. Listening to his serious answer, the child beside me was still waiting for my response. "After Mommy finishes being busy these days, I'll go home and accompany you properly. Is that okay?" Annan glanced at his father and said with a smile that it was okay. That month wasn't very pleasant. Emergencies happened frequently. During the meal, the ringtone of my mobile phone rang sharply. A major earthquake suddenly occurred in a city in the southwest. It immediately attracted full attention. The superiors gave a temporary notice asking me to lead a team to rush to the front line for an interview. I hung up the phone, quickly packed a few clothes and daily necessities, told him to take good care of Annan, and was ready to go out. Aurelius stopped me. "What?" "Be careful," he said. "I'll wait for you to come back." I didn't look at him. I walked back a few steps, kissed Annan, and replied softly with a High-rise buildings collapsed, houses were shattered. There were tears of grief and the sweat of perseverance. It was a cycle in the ruins. In the face of natural disasters, humans were as tiny as ants. In those heart-wrenching and silently sorrowful moments, my eyes became red time and time again. I always felt that there were still many things in this world that were worth doing and experiencing. The situation was serious. Under the influence of aftershocks, I accidentally tripped over rubble while interviewing and shooting. There was a bleeding cut on my arm. Fortunately, it wasn't serious. After simple dressing, I plunged into the battlefield again. At the same time, the first batch of supplies from the Aurelius family group arrived. Theodore ran over. After reporting the situation, he paused for a moment. "Sistersenna, I tinki so President Aurelius." I thought he had made a mistake. There was still a baby at home. How could that person appear here? It wasn't until I finished interviewing the armed police commander and looked up that I met a pair of impatient eyes. Aurelius wasn't wearing a suit. He was wearing a white shirt that was stained with dust. He walked over quickly and glanced at my injured arm. "It's okay as long as you're fine." Quite a few staff members were injured one after another, and some were even buried. It was also reported in the news. I didn't know what kind of mood he was in when he arrived here. For a moment, my nose felt sour and I said coldly, "Come with me." When we arrived at the temporarily set up rescue station, I found an unoccupied corner and stood there. "Do you know what you're doing?" Aurelius looked down at me. "Don't be angry. I sent Anan home. He's fine." During these past few nights, my nerves had been on high alert all the time and I lost my temper. "It's dangerous everywhere here. What if something happened, Aurelius? Have you thought about Anan?" The corners of my eyes became redder as I spoke. Aurelius tightened his fingertips. After a while, he said, "Celine, Anan is our child." The sky was gloomy and it started to rain, making the scene look even more desolate and chaotic. "But you're more important." Our eyes met and neither of us looked away. I didn't want to be in a deadlock with him. Seeing his slowly drooping eyelashes, I subconsciously raised my hand and put it on his forehead. This man had a fever. Aurelius had an intravenous drip for the whole afternoon. I sat beside him with my computer in my lap, writing the report manuscript. He didn't fall asleep either. He quietly leaned against the head of the bed and watched me. The next day, I asked him to leave first, but he just said that he would wait for me. I didn't pay attention to him. I had too many things at hand and was too busy. Finally, a week later, the headquarters asked me to take the materials and photos back to the company. After this incident, everyone in the company knew that Aurelius had come to find me on purpose. Whatever others said was another matter, and I didn't care. On the plane, I slept for most of the journey. When I woke up, there was a blanket covering me. "Sleep a little more. We haven't arrived yet." He leaned over and pulled the blanket up a bit. In my eyes, there was only his handsome profile. To this day, I still can't figure out why I fell in love with this person back then. I turned to look out of the window. The layers of clouds overlapped and there wasn't a single ray of light visible. Is loving someone like going through a tribulation? No matter how much you struggle, fate has already made arrangements long ago. All you can do is accept it. After returning to City Z, I went to the company first and then fulfilled my promise to go home and accompany the child. Anan liked to play some puzzle-like educational toys very much, but that day he was listless. "Mommy, did you and Daddy quarrel?" I paused for a moment. "No." "Yes, you did. Daddy made Mommy angry," Anan said childishly. Tutu said that if you have a conflict with someone, you can forgive him by giving him a hug. "Mommy, can you forgive Daddy?" He kept looking at the toys and swayed his toes, saying each word carefree. I didn't know how to respond for a long time. I suppressed the sourness and stuffiness in my heart. "Okay, I'll listen to our Anan. Some words might be white lies. Many separated parents end up resulting in children not getting the proper care and education they deserve. But I think that no matter how fierce the conflict between Aurelius and I is, we have always cared about Anan. What's more, I won't have another child in my life." When it was time to go to work, I set off to return to City Z. Aurelius deliberately didn't go to the company and drove me there. In late autumn, I was usually afraid of the cold. He turned on the heater in the car. "Don't overwork yourself at work. Take a rest when you're tired. When you live alone, make sure to close the doors and windows properly." He said these words gently, like a perfect lover, carefully giving reminders. "If you have anything, you can call me. It doesn't matter whether it's day or night. I'll answer the phone." The car stopped downstairs of the company. I was a bit tired of listening to him all the way. "Can you be quiet?" He held the steering wheel. Hearing this, his eyes dimmed a little. I'll be quiet." "Aurelius." There was silence. He really didn't say anything. He just looked at me, telling me that he was listening. I smiled. "Be careful on the road." I opened the door and got out of the car. After walking a few steps, Aurelius also got out of the car. "Celine." He called my name and suddenly said, "I'll come to pick you up after work later." In the sunlight, the man stood tall beside the car. He was good-looking, just like when he was a teenager. Now he was carefully waiting for my answer. Once I always watched his back and walked in confusion all the way. Until I woke up from midnight dreams. When I looked up again, I don't know when, but the moonlight from my youth was following behind me. At that moment, many fragments of memories came to my mind, the Aurelius who asked me my name when we first met. The Aurelius who had a cold face when he found out that I had lied to him. The Aurelius who held my hand in the delivery room. And the Aurelius who asked me if I would marry him. Illusory past events, love and hate had penetrated into my bones, like knives cutting deep. I'm still a stubborn person to this day. In those years, whether it was indifference or quarrels, I had never said that I didn't love him. It was only after going through the shackles of being willing to sink and being reckless that I finally understood that the prerequisite for loving someone stubbornly is to love yourself first. I curved my lips, shook my head, and sighed. No need. Aurelius didn't say anything. His eyes were dark and deep. After a long while, the corners of his lips curved slightly. I'll wait for you. He had promised, life is long and I'll wait for you slowly. The end.